Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, February 20th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Netanyahu says that he blocked a Palestinian state for decades. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday boasted that he had worked for decades to block the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said, quote, "Everyone knows that I am the one who, for decades, blocked the establishment of a Palestinian state that would endanger our existence," end quote. And so this is something we've heard commonly from Netanyahu now recently. And, it's always a big talking point that it's all the Palestinians' fault that there was never a two-state solution. But here you have Netanyahu now constantly saying that he worked to prevent a Palestinian state and that he's going to continue to do so. And he made these comments while discussing a plan to introduce legislation into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that would match a declaration made by the Israeli cabinet on Sunday that rejected international diktats related to a Palestinian state. So I covered that yesterday. That was approved unanimously by the Israeli cabinet. And these statements came after reports that said the U.S. and some of its Arab partners were looking to unveil an outline for a long-term peace deal that would include a firm timeline toward a Palestinian state. Netanyahu said that Israel is facing, quote, "an attempt to force upon us the unilateral establishment of a Palestinian state, which will endanger the existence of the state of Israel," end quote. He said the Knesset legislation will, quote, "show the world that there is wide agreement in Israel against the international efforts to force on us a Palestinian state," end quote. So a vote on this legislation was originally scheduled for Monday night, but the Jerusalem Post reported that it was delayed by hardline factions who want a stronger statement against a Palestinian state. They say because this statement rejects a unilateral creation of a Palestinian state, that it leaves open the possibility of accepting Palestinian statehood as part of future negotiations. So we'll see if they do make the statement, even more so a rejection of a Palestinian state in the future, because it looks like they want to rule it out as a possibility under any circumstance. And Netanyahu has said that, there is no future as long as he's in charge. There's no scenario where there will be a Palestinian state. Over in the U.S., you have Biden and all these U.S. officials still talking about this idea when it's so clearly rejected by the government that they're supporting in Israel. All right, so the next one here, Gantz says that Israel will launch an assault on Rafah by Ramadan. So Benny Gantz, he's a member of Israel's war cabinet. He is a former defense minister. He was in the IDF. He's considered an opposition figure, although he was included in the emergency war cabinet that Netanyahu formed after October 7th. But he threatened on Sunday that Israel will launch an assault on the southern Gaza city of Rafah if Hamas does not release the remaining Israeli hostages by Ramadan, which begins for Muslims this year on March 10th. Gantz said this at a gathering of Jewish American organizations in Jerusalem. He said, quote, "The world must know, and Hamas leaders must know, if by Ramadan our hostages are not home, the fighting will continue to the Rafah area," end quote. So as I've been covering a lot, Rafah has a pre-war population of 275,000, and it is now packed with 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering on the streets in tents all over the city. It's become a final refuge for the Palestinians in Gaza, although it has been hit by Israeli airstrikes. Last week, there was that big attack that killed around 100 people when Israel went in there and they said they rescued 2 Israeli hostages. So we've seen that, but we haven't seen Israel start, like a full-scale invasion yet. And Netanyahu has been vowing for months that he would follow through on his plans to invade Rafah, claiming that it's necessary to defeat Hamas. But Gantz's comments are the first indication of a timeline. So again, Ramadan starts March 10th. So it's not really much time. And Gantz said, quote, "To those saying the price is too high, I say this very clearly. Hamas has a choice. They can surrender, release the hostages, and the citizens of Gaza will be able to celebrate the holy holiday of Ramadan." End quote. Gantz's comments came after Netanyahu vetoed further hostage deal talks. So as far as I'm aware, there's no progress being made when it comes to the negotiations between Israel and Hamas that have been mediated by Qatar. And there's virtually no chance that Hamas is just going to release the hostages and surrender. I mean, that's not going to happen. So it seems like it's only a matter of time before they attack Rafah, unless something changes with the hostage negotiations. And the U.S. has, expressed all these concerns about the civilians in Rafah, but ultimately it's meaningless because they're still providing the unconditional military support, and the U.S. is not going to impose any consequences on Israel if they go ahead with the invasion of Rafah. And Gantz insisted that Israel will attack Rafah, quote, "in a coordinated manner, facilitating the evacuation of civilians in dialogue with our American and Egyptian partners to minimize civilian casualties," end quote. But who knows where the Palestinian civilians will be able to go. The infrastructure is destroyed in so many places in Gaza. And it's just... Israel has bombed what they have called safe zones before. And there was that report in the Wall Street Journal last week that said Egypt is building a walled camp in the Sinai Desert to prepare for Palestinian refugees. So if Israel's aware of that, I'm sure they're going to try to push them out. So it seems like there's going to be a big buildup to this invasion of Rafah. And right now, as things stand, Gaza's health ministry said on Monday that the death toll surpassed 29,000 Palestinians and more than 69,000 have been wounded. About 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. drafts its own Gaza UN resolution after threatening to veto the ceasefire. So the U.S. is circulating its own Gaza-related UN Security Council resolution after threatening to veto one that's being drafted by Algeria that calls for a humanitarian ceasefire. So the new U.S. version calls for the Security Council to express support for a, quote, temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practical based on the formula of all hostages being released, end quote. So it's essentially the what the Israeli officials are saying, and this is the U.S. position. Temporary ceasefire if all of the hostages are released. So that means that they don't support a call for a ceasefire right now, which is obvious because they threatened to veto the resolution that calls for that. But they're also saying that even if all the hostages are released, it would still be a temporary ceasefire so Israel can restart everything. So, this is just essentially the U.S. stating its position on the situation in Gaza and trying to turn it into a UN resolution. So we'll see what happens with the negotiations when it comes to which resolution will actually be brought for a vote. They might both be brought for a vote, and I would guess the U.S. would veto the Algeria one, and this one, maybe Russia would veto it or something, or maybe they would just abstain. But we'll see what happens with this. It's just another example of the U.S. giving this political cover to Israel to support the slaughter in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, the Houthis shoot down a U.S. drone and they hit a British ship. So Yemen's Houthis said on Monday that their forces downed an American MQ-9 Reaper drone that was flying over Yemen. U.S. officials have acknowledged that a U.S. drone crashed and say that they're investigating the cause. I would guess, the cause is the Houthis shooting it down. They've shot down U.S. drones before. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sarriah said, quote, Yemeni air defenses were able to shoot down an American MQ-9 with a suitable missile while it was carrying out hostile missions against our country on behalf of the Zionist entity. Yemeni armed forces will not hesitate to take more military measures and carry out more qualitative operations against all hostile targets in defense of beloved Yemen, end quote. So this is the second time that the Houthis have downed a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone since November. So the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah, they also said on Monday that they struck a British-owned cargo ship in the Gulf of Aden, which was confirmed by U.S. Central Command. The Houthis said that they fired 2 missiles at the MV Rubimar, which is a Belize-flagged British-owned bulk carrier. And U.S. Central Command, the U.S. military, confirmed that a missile did strike the vessel. And then later in the day, the Houthis said that they sank the British ship. And CENTCOM did say in their statement that they evacuated the crew from the ship. So it does seem like there's a good chance it did actually sink, or fire was so bad that they had to abandon ship. But either way, it's not a good day for U.S. and the U.K. in the Red Sea in this new war against the Houthis. And the Houthis also claimed attacks on 2 American ships, again, later in the day on Monday. I haven't seen any confirmation yet from the U.S. on that. But, this goes to show the U.S. has been bombing Yemen, Houthi-controlled Yemen, on nearly every day for the past couple weeks. But they've bombed them quite a bit since the first airstrikes were launched on January 12th. And it's done nothing to degrade, maybe to some extent it's hurting the Houthis, but nothing significant, because they're continue to step up their attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and it's just escalated the situation even more. And there's just no end in sight to this thing. All right, so the next one here, Israel carries out strikes near a major Lebanese city. So this article is from Jason Ditz, and it says Israel has once again conducted 2 major airstrikes in Lebanon, this time against the town of Gaza, which is near Lebanon's 3rd largest city of Sidon. The strike on Monday went much deeper into Lebanon than usual. It was about 40 miles into the country. The Israeli military said that it was retaliation for an explosive drone that hit near a community in Lower Galilee. They presented the attacks as hitting Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure and reported using artillery fire against other areas of Lebanon. The targeted buildings were termed in some Israel reports as weapons storage facilities, although media reports from Lebanon dispute that. Lebanese sources referred to the sites that they hit as factories and quoted owners as denying that any weapons were stored in these locations. So Israel also earlier reported different airstrikes inside Lebanon. So this continues to be pretty hot, this war, cross-border war between Israel and Hezbollah. I know it's not, a full-blown war. Nobody's invaded. But it's, these are pretty heavy strikes that Israel has been launching. And there was at least 14 people reported wounded in these, and no reports of anybody being killed, but still pretty extensive strikes. And the reports about this are saying that this is the biggest strike near such a big city, such a populated area. All right, so the next one here, Iraqi militias stopped attacks on U.S. forces at the request of an Iranian general. So a visit from an Iranian general to the Shia militias in Iraq led to a pause in attacks on U.S. forces. And this was reported by Reuters on Sunday, and the report cited Iranian and Iraqi sources. And we saw other reports and indications that Iran was telling them to stop. And this was on January 29th, which was one day after 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22 at that base in Jordan on the Syrian border. Brigadier General Esmail Khani made the trip, and he is the commander of the Iranian Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so he warned that the death of the American soldiers would likely provoke a heavy American response, and said the groups should lie low to avoid being targeted. A day after the visit, if you remember, Kateb Hezbollah, one of the most powerful Shia militias in Iraq, announced that it was suspending attacks on U.S. troops. In its statement, Kateb Hezbollah said that Iran, quote, repeatedly declared opposition to our escalation against the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, end quote. Initially, one faction did not agree to the Iranian request, and there were a few more attacks on U.S. bases, but there have been none since February 4th, which was the day 6 U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters were killed in a drone attack on a U.S. facility in Syria. So there's been none since February 4th, so that is significant because the attacks were happening just about every day since October. So there's been a calm, and I think besides the visit from the Iranian general, the Iranian pressure, the Iraqi government also seems to be stepping up its efforts to get the U.S. to withdraw, making a very public, their desire, and they did restart talks. So that might have something to do with this because that's a big goal of Kateb Hezbollah and the other Shia militias, which are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, which is part of the Iraqi security forces. They're part of Iraq's military. This is part of the reason why the Iraqi government was so angry about these U.S. airstrikes that they kept launching. So at least this one area has calmed down because this is definitely there's still the risk. There's still a major, just the U.S. presence in Iraq, the occupation of Syria. It's just such a big tripwire for a bigger war. And then there's always a risk of other parties, that have an interest in provoking a war between the U.S. and the Iranian allies in Iraq, like ISIS. They would benefit from more destabilization and, the U.S. and Iran and the Shia militias fighting against each other in a new big war. But hopefully more progress or some progress is made when it comes to these talks with the U.S. and Iraq on ending the U.S. presence. I haven't seen any real indication yet that the U.S. is, serious about this. They could just be, trying to entertain the idea and ultimately want to stay, but we'll see how it all shakes out. All right, so the next one here, Israel to limit Al-Aqsa entry during Ramadan. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and the Israeli government is planning to restrict Muslims from Al-Aqsa, which is the sacred mosque at the Dome of the Rock. The third holiest place for Muslims. So Israel's plan to restrict Palestinian Muslim worshippers access to Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan is aimed at provoking the global Muslim community and prolonging Israel's military operations in Gaza, Palestinian political and religious figures have told Middle East Eye. I think that could certainly be a part of it, especially we know that it's in Netanyahu's interest to continue everything, so angering the Arabs, I think benefits him. So a proposal put forward by Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's national security minister, to limit the entry of Palestinian civilians of Israel into the mosque was accepted by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during a meeting with senior officials on Sunday, according to a Haaretz report. The limitations will be based on criteria such as age and gender, the details of which are to be decided in the coming days. Ben-Gvir reportedly recommended that only Palestinian citizens of Israel above the age of 70 should be allowed into the mosque during Ramadan, while the Israeli police recommended entry for those aged over 45. The Shin Bet security agency opposed the decision and instead favored unrestricted access for Palestinian citizens of Israel, a source at the meeting told Haaretz. So that's interesting that Shin Bet opposed it. And again, they're talking about Palestinian, Arab citizens of Israel, not the ones living in the occupied territories. So Ben-Gvir also proposed a complete ban on Palestinians from the occupied West Bank worshiping at Al-Aqsa during the month. No decision was made on those from the West Bank so far. So we'll see if they tighten the restrictions any more than that. But it's certainly going to anger, a lot of Muslims and Arabs. All right, so the next one here, ICJ begins historic hearings on Israel's occupation of Palestine. This is another one from Middle East Eye. The International Court of Justice, which is overseeing the genocide case, they started another hearing on Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem. The International Court of Justice in The Hague began hearing submissions on Monday on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Separate to the more well-publicized genocide case brought by South Africa on Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip, The UN's highest court will hear from 52 countries and 3 international organizations on the legal consequences of Israel's decades-long occupation. The hearing will contribute to an advisory opinion, an ICJ instrument that has no binding force but carries significant legal and moral authority. The number of states participating in the oral proceedings is the highest in any case since the ICJ's establishment in 1945. And then they just give some background on the occupation. With all this war propaganda that's going on, you see people deny that Israel is, occupies the West Bank, which is stuff I used to only hear from the most hardcore Zionists and hawks. I remember Ron DeSantis saying that one time when he visited Israel, but it seems to be more of a thing that you hear now. And even though Israel's Supreme Court has ruled it an occupation, the U.S. State Department refers to the areas as the occupied territories. I mean, it's just, there's no denying that it's by definition a military occupation. All right, so the next one here, Assange's wife warns that he will die if he's extradited to the U.S. So the hearing for Julian Assange, his appeal hearing to fight his extradition to the U.S. begins today, and it will be held on Wednesday as well. And this is likely his final chance to appeal the UK decision to extradite him to the U.S., where he will stand trial for exposing U.S. war crimes. And all he did was publish documents that he obtained from a source. That's what journalists do, very standard practice. So if he's extradited and convicted, very grave implications for the First Amendment. It essentially would mean that the government could convict anybody using the Espionage Act that they want who's putting out information that they don't like. That's what it can mean. So Stella Assange, who is Julian Assange's wife, has been warning that, due to his weak mental and physical state, just the ordeal of this case, that she fears he will die if he's extradited to the U.S. And Assange's lawyer is saying the same thing. So Stella Assange told BBC that the stress from the case has left her husband in a very difficult place. She said, quote, "This case will determine if he lives or dies," essentially, end quote. So Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, has also warned that he could die if extradited due to his mental condition after being held in London's Belmarsh prison for over 4 years and the 7 years that he spent under asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy. She said, quote, "Because of the treatment he has suffered, he suffers a major depressive illness. He has been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and the medical evidence is if he was extradited to the U.S., those conditions would cause him to commit suicide. So his life is at risk, and I am not exaggerating that," end quote. And the initial decision by the UK court was that he shouldn't be extradited to the U.S. because of the conditions of U.S. prisons are too harsh, and that so the implication of that was that he could die, he might commit suicide or something in American prisons. The U.S. appealed that decision, and then they ruled to extradite him, and now this is Assange's appeal. So this is a really big deal. It's really important, this case, and there's been more pressure from the Australian government, from the Prime Minister. And the one thing that WikiLeaks and Assange supporters want Americans to do, just to put pressure on Congress right now to oppose the extradition, is there is a bill in the House that was introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, who's a Republican from Arizona. And basically, it's just a bill that says the U.S. should drop the charges. Regular journalistic activities are protected under the First Amendment. The United States should drop all charges against Julian Assange. So you could call your House representative and tell them to support this bill, say that it's important for First Amendment and press freedom in this country. So that's just a way we could, add to the calls for him to be free and put some pressure on Congress. So call your representative, do that. I've done it before for this bill. I'm going to do it again during this hearing. And you could also call your senator. That won't hurt as well. Just or email, you could always write them as well. I think calling's good for the bill stuff, but if you just want to you could make writing your senator a regular thing to just hassle their office. I think annoying politicians is a good thing. So, go do that. And then there's a story that we have lower in the page that is definitely concerning when it comes to the decision. It's from Declassified UK, and it says that the judge who was presiding over this case previously acted for MI6, the British spy agency, said that he was previously paid to represent the interests of MI6 and the Ministry of Defense, whose activities WikiLeaks has exposed. So definitely something to be concerned with. And this is Justice Jeremy Johnson. He's one of the 2 high court judges who will rule on Assange's bid to stop his extradition to the U.S. All right, so the last story here, the U.S. develops drone swarms for war with China. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute, and it's more about preparation for war with China. The U.S. Navy will test surface and underwater drone swarms next month in preparation for a future war with China. In the near term, American defense officials have warned that war with China over Taiwan could break out, and they're developing drone swarms. So Kyle's covered this before, talking about flying drones, the idea of deploying, we see their use a lot right now in Ukraine and Russia. And sometimes, they launch dozens of drones into Russia. You've had these U.S. military officials talking about making thousands of these, launching thousands of flying drones as part of a future war with China. I mean, you think about that, all these small little cheap drones just filling the sky with them. I mean, that's scary. And now they're basically talking about the same thing with underwater drones. So ways that they could hit Chinese ships. And of course, if you fire that many drones out, any sort of civilian vessel that's in the way is gonna be hit. So these are things that, you think about what World War III, kind of the technology would look like. There's a lot of scary things, not even getting into the AI and robotics and all sorts of things like that. And propaganda, especially now, I've seen the AI videos look really, some of the new stuff looks very real. There's definitely a lot in store for us when it comes to the propaganda front. But something like this, these drone swarms, just kind of, it's eerie to think about. And this is something that they're openly planning, preparing for war with China. Doesn't matter if it could go nuclear, and thinking of all these new ways to kill people. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. One from Edward Lazonsky, Fake Threats, Fake News, Fake Panic. One from Thomas Knapp, Russia, Why Navalny, and What's Next. One from W. James Antle III, Russia Hawks Missed the Point of Tucker's Putin Interview. And one from Chris Hedges, Julian Assange's Final Appeal. One from Aaron Mate, For Biden, Ending Israel's Mass Murder in Gaza is a non-starter. So that's it for me. I want to encourage everybody again. I've been putting the Defend the Guard link in the description for the phone bank. They had a win on Monday in the Arizona State Senate. I found it out kind of late today. I'll probably write that up tomorrow, get more details about it. But it's something good, we could put our time into that I think really could make a difference. Go check that out, or just go to defendtheguard.us and see what the status of the legislation is in your state. Follow us on Instagram at antiwarcom. Same handle on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at DeCampDave. Tell your friends about this show, about what we do at antiwar.com. Share it around, like, subscribe, comment. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.